more I thought about it and prayed about it, I wanted to finish at chapter 2 in Matthew that we were in last week. I don't know if I intended to last week or not. I didn't leave us hanging, but the more I read through that and thought about it, I thought, you know what, that kind of sums up a lot of stuff. And you'll see what I'm saying as we get in. And we're still decorated for Christmas, so why not talk about what happened after that initial Christmas? So we'll start with verse 13, and then we'll go until the end, which I think offhand is verse 22. So I'll just kind of read it in paragraphs, and we'll discuss it until we get to the final verses. Starting with that verse 13 in chapter 2 of Matthew. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord has spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, there's a number of things that we can glean just from this first paragraph. The first interesting thing to note is that when the angel appears to Joseph, he says, take the mother and his child, right? Is that how it goes? No, he says, take the child and his mother. Isn't that kind of an odd order? Typically, we say mother and child, right? That's just what comes out of our mouth so easily. But he says, take the child and mother. And later on in verse 14, it says that he took the child and his mother, and they left. The best explanation I've been able to find for this odd order is to stress the importance of that baby Jesus, that he was to take the child and also his mother. Not that she was a second thought, but the priority was on Jesus. Now moving on quickly in that same sentence, that command, flee to Egypt. Now, remember, I've said before, in ancient Jewish writing, location is important. Last week when we looked at the Magi, it said that they came from the east. And that east, that term east, was important because it signifies some of the beliefs of the Magi, okay? And their mystic beliefs that they practiced. Here, that word Egypt should be signifying something else to us. Just first, what does Egypt represent in the Bible? What do we know about Egypt? Joseph went to Egypt, right? He was sold by his brothers, taken to Egypt. The Hebrews then, Joseph's family, they had to come to get food from Egypt. They moved in, and then they were there for a long time, many generations, but then they began to be oppressed, and eventually Egypt becomes a thing of disdain, doesn't it? So the Hebrews, as we know, they flee Egypt, and that's where Moses let them out. We know that whole story. And from there on out in the Bible, Egypt became a notorious place, and whenever it was used, aside from literally just naming a location, but whenever that term Egypt was used, it symbolized kind of all things bad, and more specifically, just oppression. All things oppression. That's what stuck out in the mind of the Jewish people. Over 600 times in the Old Testament alone, Egypt is mentioned. Hundreds of those times, Egypt is brought up as that place of oppression, but also as a place of former victory, because God brought the Hebrew people out of Egypt. Now, with all that said, an ancient Jewish scholar, they would understand this passage very different than what we do just reading it for the first time here today. What would stand out to them? The symbology and also the irony of this whole story. And I want to explain that to you. So why was that Holy Family fleeing? Remember, it was because of the plot to kill the baby boys, right? That was Herod's idea. Now, think back to Egypt. What swayed the Pharaoh to allow the Hebrews to leave? It was the death of the firstborn sons, right? So the very same type of morbid event that brought freedom to the Israelites is going to bring restriction and oppression to baby Jesus. The very geographic location where the Israelites had experienced oppression is now the place of safety for the Holy Family. Do you see that irony there? And it's important for us to realize that, because when we see that in the Bible, it means that there's something there that we're supposed to understand. So we need to look at that irony even more here. Why is it important that we do this? Because this is showing that a tide is turning. The coin's flipped, okay? What was once one way before Jesus is now no longer. What wasn't before Jesus now is. And I think that's a truth that we can relate to today in our own lives. Do we remember in our own lives what it was like before Jesus and now what it's like with him? For some people, that's a night and day difference. And that's what we're supposed to be getting out of this passage. That since Jesus came, things have flipped completely. So the family stays there until Herod dies, which was in the year 4 BC. This is an important date because it helps to place Jesus' birth on a timeline of history. Because Herod's death is recorded in documents outside of the Bible. The Bible itself doesn't give us any dates to go off of, so it's important that they include that fact that they stayed there until Herod's death. Continuing on, then Herod, when he saw that he'd been tricked by the wise men, he became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem, in all that region, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Now, picking up on that topic of dates, this event of Herod murdering these babies isn't recorded anywhere outside of the Bible. Did you know that? This has caused many to point out that the Bible must not be accurate then, because if it was, other records would indicate that Herod, had this command to kill the babies. But in all actuality, I believe this proves authenticity rather than falsehood, and here's why. You remember what I said about Herod? He was kind of a ruthless guy. He killed 5 members of his own family. Not exactly the kind of guy you want for a friend, is it? So, this was not out of the ordinary for Herod. This wasn't something that was just random. This was just his usual day-to-day behavior. It sounds terrible when it was, but that's what he did. At the time of Jesus' birth, Bethlehem, that's where Jesus was born, that was a smaller town. There may have been like a few thousand people or so. Because of that population number, there wasn't a large amount of babies under the age of 2. They estimate it was probably between 1 and 2 dozen. We read it, and in my mind at least, it sounds like a lot. And don't get me wrong, 1 baby being killed is a lot. But comparing this to other tragedies that Herod caused, unfortunately, this event was really small peanuts because he just had murderous impulsivity. Once again, not a great guy. So, because of that, it just didn't make any other news channels than the Bible, okay? The Bible and Matthew's account is the exclusive recording of this. Doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that Matthew actually recognized something that was relatively small for what it was, an absolute tragedy. And it's significant for Jesus in the story that God was weaving because of that symbology. Once again, look at this. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Do you know where Ramah was? Ramah was just outside of Bethlehem, as was Rachel's tomb. And Rachel was kind of known as like the mother of Bethlehem. They identified with her because she was buried there. Now, almost 600 years prior to Jesus being born, Nebuchadnezzar's army, that's a name you should know, rounded up Israelite captives at Ramah, okay, just outside Bethlehem. So when Isaiah, who prophesied these things before that roundup had occurred, before Jesus had been born, when he prophesied these things, he actually made two prophecies within one statement. First, about that exile that was going to occur, and second, about Jesus' birth. So on the first go-around, when there was the exile, there was weeping because people were being taken away. When Jesus' family fled, though, there was weeping because of those that remained. You see what I'm saying? Two exact opposite sides of the coin. Isaiah prophesied of hope amid the pain because that exiled nation would eventually return, and they did. Matthew explains the hope despite the sorrow that they were feeling because the Messiah had come, but ironically was in exile for his safety. Matthew is revealing to the reader that these tears, the tears from the exile, the original exile, the tears from this massacre, have really purchased them this hope that they can now have in the Messiah. Verse 19 says, "But when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' And when he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." So Herod dies, and then Joseph gets word from an angel that they can head back to Israel, leaving the safety of Egypt, because at that time it actually was safe for Jewish people to be in Egypt. On his way, though, he learns that Herod had actually changed his will, and that's not a joke, that's actually what happened. He changed his will, and because of that, Joseph needed to change plans. Originally, Herod Antipas, who, if you remember, he's the one that Jesus will stand before in trial, he'll speak with him during that time, was supposed to roll over his father's kingdom, all of it. While he wasn't really the greatest guy, he was much more predictable than his father, and he was actually somewhat of a devout Jew. On the other hand, his half-brother, Archelaus, was known to be as ruthless or more ruthless than his father, the guy that killed 5 of his family. So, him being in control of the region where Bethlehem was situated, Joseph settles in Nazareth of Galilee, which is actually where Joseph was from, but it seems like he didn't want to return there, and there's good reason why. Today we hear those names, Nazareth and Galilee, and we think of Jesus, and they're really biblical sounding names. They have a good ring to them in our minds. But at that time, neither was a desired location. Galilee was not a desired region. Nazareth was not a desired town within Galilee. It's kind of like, you ever see those ads on Facebook Marketplace? Those of you that scroll on there like I do. You'll see a nice looking house for sale. Dave, I know you see them. You see a house for like $5,000 and it's a mansion, and you're like, oh, what's with this house? And you scroll and it's like, oh wow, they got new hardwood floors. Oh wow, they just painted it. Oh, this is a nice place. And then you scroll through and you see that it's in Sharon or something like that. And you're like, oh, that's why it's $5,000. You couldn't pay me to live there. That's the kind of location that Nazareth was, okay? Not a desired location to live. Remember a few weeks ago, I said that Jesus actually had kind of like a redneck dialect. That's because he grew up in Galilee, in Nazareth. You've probably heard it said, they'll say, oh, ladies love guys with accents. Well, not all accents, okay? And we know that. The dialect Jesus spoke was not a desired dialect. Read that last sentence again. It says, and he went and lived in that city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. So Nazarene, somebody from Nazareth, makes sense. But here's the interesting thing with that statement that Matthew gives us. He says that he'll be called a Nazarene to fulfill what the prophet said. Any idea which prophet prophesied that? Just take a guess. You're wrong. Any other guesses? Joel? No. So this is kind of a trick question. We're not going to deduct any points from either of you for today. No prophet said that he would be from Nazareth. So, why does Matthew say that? Is it an error? No, not exactly. Here's the thing. Numerous times in the Old Testament, the Messiah is described as being despised and rejected. Just from the Psalms alone, describing the Messiah. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. I have become a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my mother's sons. Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to one deeply despised and abhorred. Here's what Matthew was saying. He's a Nazarene because he's despised. That was kind of like a derogatory term of the day, to call someone a Nazarene. All right. Regionally, there's sometimes derogatory terms that we use. That's exactly what this was. It wasn't that a prophet said he'd be from Nazareth. The prophet said he'd be despised. And Matthew says here, despised he was because he was from Nazareth. They were a lower class compared to the rest of the Jews. So why did Jesus come to be born in Bethlehem? Remember, that was a noble city. That was David's hometown. But then become Nazarene? Here's the key. So that he could relate to us. So that he could fully live out that Emmanuel, God with us name that we celebrate here at Christmas time. He was the God who came to be with us so that we could be like him. That's the gift that we celebrated just last week at Christmas, and it's the truth that we live out the whole year long. As we go into communion this morning, and I ask the ushers to come forward, would you focus on that? Would you think about that Emmanuel, God who came to be despised and rejected so that we could be like him?